Kokanee are freshwater sockeye salmon and a really popular target for anglers using conventional gear. But is it possible to catch these critters on a fly rod? Today on Untangled, we're going to tackle that question. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durrant. Real quick, just want to start the show off by asking everybody, wherever you listen to this podcast, if you could please rate it, leave a review, just to help spread the word a little bit. Give us hopefully you're leaving 5-star ratings, right? Seriously, leave a review, leave us a rating. It really does go a long way in helping this little podcast reach more and more folks, and hopefully helps more and more people, have a better day out on the water. That's what we're all here for in the first place anyways. So if you guys and gals listening could do that, that would be wonderful. Now, today's show is going to be a pretty good one. We've got a lot of different topics to cover. We're going to be talking about kokanee on a fly rod, how you can kind of limit your fly patterns, starting kids with fly fishing, buying wading boots, and catching the Grand Slam in Colorado. So quite a bit to wade through on today's episode, and hopefully y'all aren't experiencing too much of cabin fever as I am right now, because the weather's beautiful, finally. We're not freezing to death anymore, but the rivers are all high and muddy, and it's been so windy that trying to fish out on the lakes has just been a pain in the butt. So it's like the worst of all the instances, right? The weather's finally perfect. You can be outside and not freeze to death, and the fishing's just no good. So hopefully wherever you're at and listening to the show, the fishing's a little bit better for you. I wanted to start the show off today, though, with a couple of short questions. I like these kind of shorter ones I can lead the show off with. So don't be afraid to submit some of your questions that might not need as detailed of an answer as some of the other questions that we answer here on Untangled, because any question is going to make it on the show, within reason. Obviously, if somebody writes in and asks me to, pick between Mountain Dew or Diet Coke, I'm going to have a really hard time making that decision. Or, do you want fries with your wings or no fries with your wings? Like, I'm not going to have a hard time making that decision. No. So, some questions I'll take, but almost every question is going to make it on the show. So even if you think it's a little too small, a little too insignificant, don't worry about that, okay? First question comes to us. Justin from Colorado writes in and says, I'm looking in to get my first set of waders. I'm not certain on if I should go pant or full bib. Also, can I just use an old pair of hiking boots instead of buying boots specifically for wading? Thanks, and love the tips. Justin, good set of questions there. Get the chest waders. You're going to be glad that you did, especially in Colorado during the winters or during the colder months. It's just nice to have a little bit of an extra layer up there. Plus, you can wade out a little bit further. You can get above waist deep if you've got chest waders. And I know you're probably thinking, well, I'm never going to wade more than chest deep. Well, you never know, right? So it's nice to have the option. That's why I always recommend go with the chest waders. It's nice to have that option to get out into slightly deeper water. Plus, if you ever decide to float tube, you're definitely going to want chest waders for that as well. Now, your question about wading boots. Short answer here, you definitely want to buy wading boots. Hiking boots are not made to be submerged for long periods of time like wading boots are. Wading boots are built from specific materials that are designed to handle the abuse of wading, like hitting all the rocks, tripping over everything when you stomp your feet because you're so mad that you missed a fish. And it's probably only me who does that and looks like a toddler out there on the river while I have my, more fly rods and friends. If you listen to the last episode, you know where that one's coming from as well. If you do wear wading boots or hiking boots with your waders, they're going to fall apart super quick. And on top of that, you're making a pretty good investment in your waders to begin with. So you want to protect those with a good set of boots. Honestly, boots are one of the things that I say, spend the money you can, get the nicest stuff you really can. Fly rods, it's nice to have a real fancy fly rod, but wading boots for the majority of anglers, you're gonna get more ROI on that than you are a super fancy fly rod, just because you'll be more comfortable, you'll be more stable in the water if you've got a good set of boots. So I would definitely go that route. Thanks for that question, Justin. And then another Colorado question. See, I don't think I'm making enough Colorado jokes these days. I think I got to get back on the horse of doing that. And, I'm from Utah and I live in Wyoming now, so there's plenty of ammunition to holler at our friends in the other square state. Anyways, Charlie from Colorado writes in, says, I'm new to fly fishing and was fishing a stream in Colorado and ran into someone who said he had caught the Grand Slam, rainbow, brown, brook, and Colorado cutthroat trout, and they were exactly where they should be in the river. What did he mean by that? Charlie, it's kind of hard to say for sure, but I'd guess that he meant the fish were in the stretch of river that they're usually found in. If he's talking about different species like that, that would kind of be my guess, because often brookies are found up much higher in a river system than browns or rainbows. So that'd be my guess. Hope that's helpful. And thanks again, Charlie and Justin, for those two short questions. And with that, we're going to jump into the main part of the show. So our first main question comes to us today. Clint from Utah writes in and says, what age do you recommend with starting kids on fly fishing? Currently have a 10, 8, and 2-year-old. Well, I'll tip my cap to you, Clint. Those are some fun ages, and I'm not being sarcastic. I mean that. Those are some fun ages. We've done a little bit of fly fishing for the 10 and 8-year-old, but ended in tangles early and not much success. Sounds like me 90% of the time I go fishing. Most importantly, I want them to enjoy fishing, catch fish, and respect the outdoors no matter how we do it. Clint, really fun question here, and I appreciate you putting this in. I'm actually kind of surprised that this is our first question about taking kids fly fishing. So I'm glad to see that folks are still out there doing it. And I'm sure that plenty of folks are going to have an opinion on this. So if y'all don't agree with the advice that I'm giving, or there's something that I left out, please feel free to let me know via social media. Get in touch. I'd love to hear some other tips. I don't have kids. I do work with kids, though, right? I'm a teacher. And I've had the opportunity to take quite a few kids fly fishing, younger kids as well. So I do have some experience in that realm, even though I'm not a parent. I just want to be really upfront with where this is coming from. We always talk about, or I've always heard the saying like, oh, well, if you're not a parent, you can't comment on how to parent. And I'm like, well, wouldn't teaching school qualify me on talking how to parent? I just curious. I think that's a valid question to be asking. But anyways, I just want to be completely upfront. So that we're not curious about that. So anyways, I think there are two big things to remember when you're taking kids out fly fishing. First one is you've got to be able to teach without being frustrated that you didn't catch any fish and that you lost, for lack of a better word, a day of fishing opportunities. Okay, and then you also want to take those kids out at an age where they're able to actually understand your instructions. And I'm gonna dive into both of those points in a little bit more detail here, but I do want to share a little bit of a story first. I guided a 9-year-old a couple of years ago, and she got the hang of fly fishing super quick. I actually wrote a story about this for Hatch Magazine. I've got that linked in the podcast description for y'all. But this girl, we took her out, and props to her, man, because it was snowing that morning, and I called her mom. It was the mom and the daughter wanted to go fishing, and they just wanted a half day. So I took them up, and I called the mom. I said, hey, it's supposed to snow. It's supposed to be really cold. If you guys want to reschedule, I completely understand. Just let me know. She said, no, we're doing it. We're doing it. I said, all right. So we shoot up the canyon. We settle up in a little bit of a run, and the kid, she took to it super, super quick. She figured out roll casting really well. She was setting the hook when the indicator stopped, and she ended up putting, off the top of my head, I think she ended up putting almost a dozen fish in the net in a half day, and that was her first time ever fly fishing. I couldn't believe it. It was the most impressive thing that I'd ever seen. Well, that might be a little hyperbole, right? It was really stinking impressive, though, to watch a 9-year-old fish better than I probably could. Right now, there's a little bit of beginner's luck, and even 9-year-olds are going to get beginner's luck, okay? But there was a lot of just intuition that she just kind of figured out. It was really cool. And I think that's kind of the age where a kid can do that, right? That 9 to 10 age is a sweet spot where they can just get into it and just figure it out. It's really cool to watch when that happens. Now, in the broadest sense, I would say that you want to take kids out when they're at an age that you won't be frustrated with them the entire time. The kids are never going to enjoy fishing if you spend the entire time just mad or visibly frustrated with them, and kids pick up on that a lot more than you would expect. I think that's one of the big things that I've learned teaching English is the kids can actually tell when something's bothering you, and they're a lot more empathetic than we give them credit for sometimes. And obviously, Clint, I'm not saying that you're out teaching your kids and you're just, oh my goodness, you can't do this, you're an idiot, you know, being the prototypical grumpy dad that nobody wants, you know, being like Red from that 70s show, if anybody happens to also love that little show. But I do think it's something that's worth thinking about as adults before we introduce our kids to something we love is, are we going to be able to help them and not get frustrated? Especially if you take them out and you're spending the better part of a day, you're probably not going to catch a whole lot of fish those first few times. Can you handle that? Can you handle losing a day of catching in return for a day of teaching and, you know, hopefully planting the seed so you got a lifetime fishing buddy? I'd look at it that way. Those are the biggest keys that I've seen in adults who are successful at taking their kids fishing. It's the ones who don't get frustrated are going to have the best results. So hopefully that's helpful, Clint. Appreciate you taking the time to submit that question to us. Thank you. Look, fly fishing isn't supposed to be that difficult, right? I mean, sure, you need a lot of money, like a 401k and, you know, real deli meat, not the mystery meat. You've got to be in a certain tax bracket to succeed with fly fishing, right? No, you don't. That's what it used to be like, right? Fly fishing used to be really tough to figure out. Everybody spoke Latin, it seemed like the whole time. These days, it's a lot easier to gain knowledge before you get out on the water and kind of crush that learning curve. Make your beginning experiences with fly fishing a ton of fun. That's what Untangled is here for, and that's why I want to get questions from you guys that I can answer on the show. So if you've got a question about fly fishing that you think would help improve your time out on the water, please click the link in the podcast description and submit that question to us. That is what keeps the show going, and that's how I'm able to help you guys realize you don't actually need, you know, a 5-figure bank account and the latest and greatest truck to go out and have a good time fly fishing. So get those questions submitted. All right, next question comes to us. Wyatt from Wyoming writes in. It says, Spencer, you previously talked about limiting to a few patterns you know you'll use, then adding a ton of variations to your box. How do you change a pattern to make a new variation, and why? Specifically, I'm tying Rainbow Warriors and Frenchies and changing the color and size. Wyatt, it's a really good question. To recap, for those who haven't heard, it's been said that a lot of us anglers go through a sort of progression where we start out fly fishing and we want every fly we can find. We don't care if it looks like that fly is on crack. We want that fly. We want it in our box because, dadgummit, that fly might catch a fish, and we don't want to be out on the river and not have the only fly that's going to catch a fish, right? We've all probably seen that situation play out. Some of us may have even been in a situation that felt that way. Usually the fish aren't keyed in that much on a specific pattern. We'll get into that, or we've gotten into that later, or on previous episodes, pardon me. But there's that desire to have every fly under the sun when you start out fly fishing. But as we settle into fly fishing, especially if you round into some home waters and you fish those regularly throughout the year, you start to realize that you're probably only using a couple dozen different patterns at most to get the fish that you fish for most often. Now, if you travel a lot to fish, okay, if you're one of those people that's making the rest of us hate you on Instagram, well, it's going to be different for you. You're going to have to tie a few more flies. You're not going to be able to consolidate as much. But for the average angler out here, all right, who fishes the same waters close to home, that's going to hold true, that you're going to end up just using a smaller variety of flies. Just you find out what works, and once you do that, there's kind of a desire to not tweak that as much. You're going to tweak your presentation, but you tweak the fly a little bit less. Eventually, that means that we're all going to end up, well, I shouldn't say all. I think most of us are going to end up with a box that's got our staple patterns in it, but a ton of variations on those staple patterns based on where you fish. An example of this, I love high country lake fishing. It's a lot of fun. The fish are stupid and easy, so it makes me feel like I am an incredible angler when I can go up there and catch 50 fish in a day. Never mind that a monkey could do it, probably better than me with his monkey hand-tied flies, like we talked about on the last episode as well. But I've got one basic chironomid pattern that I use in my high country lakes. It's the ice cream cone. But I have a ton of variations on that pattern. It kind of makes it a little unique to me. I'm not claiming that it's a new or fancy pattern or special in any way. It's just I tie it differently than some other people do. I experiment with different body materials, thread colors, wire colors, and I sort of dial that in to see what the fish in my area like. And once I figure out what they like, I just tie more and more of those. I add some variations every now and then just to experiment, but that's one way that you can consolidate your fly selection, but still expand it in terms of variation. So with that said, what are some ways that we can add variety to our fly patterns and make sure that they're dialed in for the waters that we fish the most often? Well, you can really mess with like 5 things. You can mess with the color, the size, the materials. You can add some flair, like some soft tackle or some flash, or you can just simplify an existing pattern. I'm going to dive into all 5 of those real quick, just give you some examples. All right. Color and size are pretty self-explanatory here. You can change, for example, if you have a bunch of black zebra midges, tie red ones or tie olive ones, right? If you have a bunch of Frenchies with a gold bead, try them with a pink bead, okay? Just add some variety there. I tie a wide range of sizes in most of my go-to nymphs so that they'll work in a variety of situations. An example of that, we'll go back to the Frenchie here, is that I like to tie my Frenchies in like a size 18 all the way up to a 14, sometimes a 12 if it's really late at night and I'm running on like 4 Diet Cokes. I've just been pounding them. Things get crazy at the tying bench, let me tell you, especially if I haven't had wings in a week or so. Whew, boy, the stuff you can whip up when you're a little strung out like that, man. No, I like having those flies in different sizes because it gives you a pattern that you're confident in that's going to work both as like the point fly in a nymph rig or as a smaller dropper in a dry dropper setup. So you kind of get the best of both worlds when you tie your flies that you know work really well in a variety of sizes. Something that I really like to do to fly patterns is to use different materials to tie them. Sometimes, like, it doesn't matter that you use the exact quill from the butt of a blue-footed booby, right? You can get away with utilizing the materials that you have, usually to good results. You don't have to go get that exact super rare fly that only the one, or material that only the one fly shop sells, okay? You can take advantage of what you got, see what's close, and tie with that. An example of that would be I tie a ton of hare's ears, and I just use natural rabbit dubbing instead of actually clipping fibers from a hare's mask and making up my own dubbing, as a lot of different folks do. The book that I learned to tie flies from recommended doing that as well. I don't. I just use natural rabbit dubbing. And it seems to work pretty well for me. Another example, I've got a big package. In fact, right here, I'll hold them up for the camera. So if you're watching, I got this big package. It's whiting, 4B's hen saddle, natural dark down. Bought it from Fly Fish Food a while ago. And I just use these for tail feathers on like 90% of my flies. Even if it calls for Coke de Leon or something else, I just use these because they work. And it's what I've got. I think these were probably on sale when I bought them. Usually that's how a lot of stuff ends up in my tying desk is, oh yeah, it was on sale. That's why I needed it, darling. Yeah. The wife's wondering where all the grocery money went. Well, it went to fly stuff, okay? And I'll go out and catch a fish. So it's like I spent grocery money on food eventually. Okay, darling? No, my wife doesn't give me a hard time about fly tying supplies. Thank goodness. If she did, I'd probably be divorced by now. Oh, but the whole point of that is just try swapping materials out for something that's close to what's called for in the recipe and stuff that you've got on hand. I think that's a really good skill for tyers to develop too, because you don't always have what you need. And if you live in the middle of absolutely nowhere, like I do, it's not always convenient to just run down to the fly shop and get the materials that you're missing. Amazon 2-day delivery is more like Amazon 20-day delivery here in Wyoming. So it's a good skill to develop for tyers. Finally, the last thing that I mentioned as far as kind of making these your own is you can simplify patterns. This is something that I do a lot, mostly because, well, I'm lazy. That's a number one thing right there, I'll tell you that. But a good example of this is the parachute Adams. I tie a ton of Adams flies. They just work, right? I know they're old. They're the OG for a reason, though. It's like Johnny Cash. It never gets old. But I don't think I've ever tied like a by-the-book Adams with grizzly and brown hackle or with the upright wings. I've never done it. I just simplify the pattern. I use one piece of hackle, and then I use an Antron post to help me see the fly instead of those wings. And the reason I do this is the fish don't really see those upright wings, right? It's just us anglers who see those sticking up. So I might as well tie that in a way that is even easier for me to see, which is why I use the Antron to replace the wing. And then as far as alternating the hackle colors, I'm just not convinced that makes enough of a difference to really matter. So I just hackle my Adams really thick instead of using 2 strands and making sure that I've got grizzly and brown both the same size. I just put extra hackle on, just wrap it thicker than I normally would. This works for me. It simplifies the fly by a few steps, and it adds variety to the box so that my Adams isn't exactly like everybody else's Adams. That's another key, that the more of a personal spin you put on things, I think the fish can respond to that really well, especially if you fish places that receive a lot more pressure. If your flies aren't a carbon copy of the 1,000 others those fish have seen that day, I think that can help you catch fish sometimes. I know I've seen that happen to me. I can't scientifically prove that, but it's one of those things that it feels good, so it's got to be right? I mean, it's 2023. Let's just go with that. Well, hopefully that question was, or hopefully that answer was everything that you hoped for there, Wyatt. Thanks for taking the time to send that question in. Really do appreciate it. And just like that, we are at the very end of the show. I'm going to answer the question that we teased in the hook of the show. Gunnar from Oregon writes in, says, advice for fishing kokanee. I've only gear fished from my boat for kokanee on the lake, trolling with flashers, jigging, corn on the tip. Depth is always deep, 20 to 60 feet. Is there a way to effectively fly fish on still water for kokanee? This is a really fun question, Gunnar. I've actually had this question myself a few years ago. I really wanted to catch kokanee, and I understood that you had to get it deep, and I understood that you had to troll for them. I knew that part of it. And I decided, because I didn't have a boat at the time, I still don't have a boat now. That's a whole other story that we'll get into. But I I was so determined. I made a post on a forum I was a member of and said something to the effect of, well, I'm just going to troll really deep with my fly rod off of my float tube and kick, and hopefully I'll end up into a kokanee. And thank goodness a buddy of mine, he's a buddy now, but somebody on the forum saw that, took pity on me, messaged me, took me out on his boat, and we caught kokanee that way. It was a ton of fun. But I was a lot dumber then when I made this decision to, I'm just going to go out on the float tube and kick around, and I'll be able to kick it 2.8 miles per hour and get my fly to 60 feet or whatever, because I thought it was just that simple, right? It's not, but I thought it was, because I'm not all that smart. I certainly wasn't back then. Well, and let me back up just a little bit too. For those who don't know, kokanee are freshwater salmon. They're a sockeye salmon, but they don't migrate to the ocean. They live in freshwater lakes, and they spawn up rivers just like any other salmon. They spawn once they die. They're really popular here in Wyoming, down in Utah, throughout the West where they've been planted. They're just a really popular fish. They taste great. They taste just like sockeye you catch up in Alaska. They're not as big, but they taste really, really good, and they're relatively easy to catch if you're rigged up for them. With that said, just like Gunnar mentioned in his question, they're usually down pretty deep, 20 to 60 feet deep. To my knowledge, there's nobody fishing kokanee in still water with flies unless you're catching them as they run up the river to the lake that they're living in. I've caught a few that way, late fall before they're spawning. They're kind of staging below the mouth of the river before they run up. I've caught a few that way. I wasn't even targeting them. I was targeting some other fish that were cruising the shallows, caught some kokanee that way before. I do know a few folks who've gotten kind of lucky and caught the odd kokanee through the ice when they've been out ice fishing. But really, for the most part, kokanee are just down. They live their life a lot deeper than you can feasibly and easily get with a fly rod. Now, that said, if anybody does fish kokanee on a fly rod in a lake and you do it successfully, please let me know. I would love to hear how that's done, because to my knowledge, it's just not feasible with the fly rod setup to get a fly down that deep and hook up with the fish. So if anybody's doing it, I would love to hear about it. That wraps up the show today, though, folks. I really appreciate everybody who takes time, as always, to write in your questions. That's what makes this show go round. So if you've got a question that you'd like answered, please submit it. There's always a link in the podcast description. And until next week, everybody, tight lines.